Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I am Stephanie Peirolo.
And I'm Eugene S. Robinson.
And today is episode 44, The Profligate Boss.
And lucky 44.
Yeah. According to my Merriam-Webster app, profligate means wildly extravagant. So today we are going to talk about bosses who are wildly extravagant, or as I used to hear when I was a kid growing up, they spend money like drunken sailors.
I might know somebody like that. And that would be me as a boss.
Really? Tell me more.
Yeah. I took my staff out. I talked about it recently because it was probably my best dining experience ever. A restaurant called Aquavit in New York when Marcus Samuelson was the head chef there. And it cost so much money that members of the staff, though I had told them that I was picking up the bill, started disappearing before meal end because they did not want to get stuck with any portion of the bill. I think, for the staff, I ended up spending, $14,000, $15,000 on a meal for 10 people. Yeah, it was pretty pricey, but it was worth every single nickel of it, both in terms of what we eaten and what it did weirdly for morale. Now, did it improve the bottom line of the magazine? Well, the occasion was the magazine turning its first profit in under a year. So it was at 11 months, which is unusual for printed magazines. And of course, did it bite us in the ass? Yes, it did. Because as soon as we turned out our first profitable issue, the company sold it to Condé Nast.
Oh. Okay. But so what you're saying is that you felt like there was a return on investment.
And every profligate boss that I've ever known has uttered to me at one point or another, you have to spend money to make money.
Okay. Well, and I think that's a good tension to start with, because we're going to get to advice. What do you do if you have this boss? Right. And the understanding that there's going to be narratives and that there's going to be an understanding. Some people are thinking they're making an investment. They believe that the return on investment, although not visible to a CFO or a bookkeeper or in an Excel spreadsheet, may actually accrue from the psychological benefit of team building for this type of an entertainment expense. So I think that's a good way to think about it. And
there's also an adage that you haven't mentioned that goes quite hand in glove with this, which is good money after bad. And I've experienced that phenomena as well, which is, in other words, a profligate boss where profligacy is a problem. And I've experienced that very recently, in fact. So.
Well, and one of the other circumstances you talked about entertainment, which, having worked in advertising agency land for a long time, particularly in what was more of a heyday, it was nothing for me to pick up bills that were, thousands of dollars, or for clients to agree to a meeting because they knew that I would take them to, a specific restaurant or what have you. I think there are some industries where that happens, or that did happen. What's interesting is the idea of how people can get caught out on travel, right? So there's a number, those of you that are in New York or follow the news from New York understand that Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, is in big trouble, in fact, federally indicted, because of his love for luxury travel and his disinclination to pay for it himself. So what happened is
something I sympathize with 100%. Anyway,
you sympathize with what? Wanting to not travel and
once you fly first class, you never want to fly any other class. I understand that the man would stumble over something like that, but God love you, first class is wonderful.
It is. However, he says that his flights and upgrades and, travels. It was the Turkish National Airlines that would give him these upgrades, right? Where he would pay $300 for a seat that would cost you or me $9,000.
Yep.
Right? And in return, he did work for them, advocated for them, He says it's a gift. Other people say bribe. He now has federal indictments that prove that this was probably not the wisest move. But what's interesting is there was an article in the New York Times by Sarah Lyall, and what they did is they went through and retraced his steps and figured out how much it would cost, right? I mean, he's accused in a federal indictment of corruptly accepting more than $100,000 in illegal gifts, including expensive airline seats and stays in hotels, in exchange for using his political influence to help Turkey. That's a quote from the article. Yeah. He has pleaded not guilty to 5 felony counts. And then when you look at this article in the New York Times, which has the pictures, right? He stayed in this suite in Istanbul that was, there were champagne coolers in the leather sofas, more than one. Right? So it's like one of the little details, right? Yeah, he was in business class, to be fair, not first class, but it's the lie down seats, the eye mask, whatever, all of those kinds of things. And I think what's interesting is that the impunity with which he operated. I mean, so putting aside the whole treason aspect,
Clarence Thomas says what? Never mind.
Another individual who feels entitled to a level of travel that and none of this he's paying for, right? Like Eric Adams is not paying for this. This is not part of his official duties as the mayor of New York. And I think what's interesting is this sense of impunity, this idea that like, I deserve this. This is somehow part of what is due to me, or that no one is going to find out. He's an elected official. Clarence Thomas is a Supreme Court justice for the United States of America. And yet there is an assumption that they get to do this. What is that about?
The worst case I heard was a guy who said, listen, I need a week to close this deal, open expense count, that's it. So the guy goes off for a week and he goes to some place, the details are fuzzy now, goes to some place where clearly Macau or Vegas or Atlantic City, and he runs up, gets a presidential suite, and runs up over the course of 4 days, $46,000, close to $50,000 in bills, food / entertainment, comes back without the deal signed. Says, if I just had a few more days, the company gives him a few more days, goes off and spends another tranche of time, $36,000 the second time around. Now we're injured toward $100,000, no deal signed, and the guy goes, well, the guy's a hard nut to crack. Sorry. He wasn't fired. Was not fired. Now, I remember the story for as long as I did because it fits in my mind a certain racial narrative. I don't know if I could go off and spend close to $100,000 and come back with no deal signed, or maybe if you could do that. But he was allowed to do that and stayed healthily employed with his team under him, having drawn from his example, that results don't always have to be forthcoming, I guess. That is the worst profligate boss I've ever heard because he failed to deliver on each and every count, but succeeded in spending a lot of money to do so.
And face no consequences, because I think one of the reasons that these profligate bosses continue, and you're right, they're mostly white guys. The reason that they keep getting away with this is that they don't face consequences. And I think there can be 2 tiers to this. One tier is what you just said. I mean, it's the mediocre white guy who, other mediocre white guys believe the lies that he's
Listen, I don't say he was mediocre. I mean, he just spent like 8 days pleasure cruising it through Macau with an unlimited budget.
There's a skill set there. Okay, there's a skill set there. But so that's one where there's just a lack of cultural accountability or assumptions about narratives or people just buy that con. I think the other one is there can be structural gaps, right? So there's been a couple of stories as I was researching this about very large nonprofits who had leaders who were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on travel, who were flying first class, booking luxury hotels to go to conferences that weren't necessary. Like there was nothing that was justified. And, particularly for a nonprofit. And some of these nonprofits were saying that they, were very frugal with their operating expenses and all the money went to whatever their charitable endeavors were. Clearly, there's a lack of fiduciary oversight. And so that's another problem too, is that, is there a cultural assumption that certain leaders, for whatever reason, can do no wrong? Right? Or is there a structural piece that's missing where there just isn't the oversight? Or is there oversight, but the people who might be the financial whistleblowers are not going to be listened to?
Yeah, I've also found that in the case most recently with Aussie Media, that Mike Moe, who's the head of venture capital guy at GSV and was one of the last standing board members at Aussie, and he was asked, he has a newsletter, and in his newsletter, there's a Q&A, and he was asked a question which was, I believe, thinly veiled question, or an attempt for him to create a question where he could deal with the Aussie situation. It's like, how much rope do you want to give people? And his attitude was, I don't know their business. I know the people. I don't know the business. I know the people. And I'm a firm believer in letting people work their magic. You're willing to let the guy take your watch, put it in a handkerchief, smash it with a hammer, because you believe when he takes it out of the top hat, the watch will be restored. It's this kind of, Silicon Valley magic. It happens. It happens. Sometimes a WeWork guy is a successful guy, not just a guy padding around the office with no shoes, running up bills. I mean, sometimes it works, I guess, right?
Well, but the question is, what's interesting to me, I mean, first, let's just call it is always a WeWork guy.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there are many, many women who have great business ideas, who have an experienced track record, who can't get funding, right? Particularly women of color. I mean, let's just acknowledge that it's usually a man that is getting this kind of attention. And, I wonder, because I think, and this brings us to the next idea, is that sometimes the profligate boss isn't searching for personal luxury or enrichment. They are caught up in the hype.
Yeah.
Right. And they aren't able to see clearly. Right. I mean, one of the things that surprised me about the situation with Carlos is I worked with him. I met him. It did not take me long to understand.
Yeah.
I wouldn't give him a watch.
Yeah.
I wouldn't let him do, I mean, it didn't seem, it wasn't subtle. Right. I mean, and yet there were people who were willingly giving this guy, millions and millions of dollars. And I'm not suggesting that I'm some super judge of character, but in watching some of the, watching the documentary on WeWork, portions of that, it's like there were some things where it's like, do you just have just business common sense, looking at someone's track record, looking at how they deal interpersonally, and not understanding or seeing the red flags? I mean, and certainly there are people who are really good con men or women. I mean, they can tell a story, they can scam people, people fall for it. But sometimes you just look from the outside and you're just like, how did you think that this would be a good investment? How did you think that this guy would be able to start a successful company? And I would hope that venture capitalists would be a little bit more astute. But I think part of it is they get caught up in the hype, right? Like what Carlos was selling in the beginning was incredibly, it was so interesting. Like I remember thinking the desire to have a group of people of color look at news in a different way was really enticing. It was really appealing. Right. And I can see people getting caught up in the hype. So I think that's another challenge. I mean, there was an article on this morning, Friday is when we're recording this, about how Microsoft has invested a ton of money into OpenAI, which is the company that makes ChatGPT. And it's souring on it now. And they don't necessarily want to keep pouring money in there. And the question is, did they make the right kind of deal with Microsoft? And my experience there, and this is a little bit of ancient history, but I was working at a company called Aquantive. They had an agency called Razorfish that was purchased by Microsoft in 2007.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, it was the largest purchase of a software company, which is what they
Mm-hmm.
were. They had an advertising software called Atlas, which was kind of the point of the company and why Microsoft bought it. And it was purchased in 2007 for $6.3 billion with a B.
Mm-hmm.
Because they wanted that Atlas software. And Atlas software was a fantastic software for what's called display advertising, right? So this is banners, this is not search, it's display, right? So Microsoft spent $6.3 billion and then decided that they really wanted to double down on search advertising, which is what you do in Google, because at the time they had something called Bing. So according to an article in GeekWire written by John Cook, in 2012, Microsoft recognized that this had not worked and they took a write down, right? They wrote off the sale to the tune of $6.2 billion with a B dollars. Almost the entire investment turned out to be a loss. And what this article says is that they spent $6 billion on display software and then realized they really wanted to put all of their money into search because they wanted to compete with Google, which is it's kind of like buying a rugby team and then deciding you really want to double down on water polo. It's not the same equipment. It's not the same people. It's not the same skill set. But it was just a complete disaster. Right. And
was this under Steve Ballmer?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Yes, how did I know? Okay.
And, and it still is actually talked about in the industry as just a complete debacle. And it was unfortunate too, because Aquantive was a really cool company. And
Razorfish is dead now, right?
No, Razorfish still exists. Yeah, Razorfish still exists. It just is owned by Publicis now. So they got passed around. But I think that is something that's another reason. So these are, leaders who Ballmer at the time had some acclaim and they're respected and they think that they are getting ahead of the rush, that they are participating in, they're buying low and they're going to sell high. It's going to do, whatever. And maybe Microsoft is doing the same thing now with their just pouring money into OpenAI.
Well, as of an hour and a half ago, Microsoft stock was down. I check. So, who alerted me to it was a executive at Google. He said, have you seen Microsoft? So, your story carries a bit of weight.
Right. So today. I guess the question is, what do you do if you work for a boss like this, right? If this is resonating and you have concern about your organization, what do you do? Well, the first thing you can do is try to get them to listen to experts. One of the things that happens is, as you've mentioned, people who are profligate spenders have a narrative, and often their narrative is not accurate. Right? And it's very rarely connected to the bottom line or the top line or any sort of specific financial metrics. So what you want to try to do is to find a person who understands financial metrics and get your profligate boss to listen to that person.
It's almost impossible. There was nothing that was going to stop Carlos Watson from doing super expensive Times Square buys for posters with his face on it. I'm talking not just the subway buyouts with the kiosk and the posters in the subway and bus stations and the sides of buses, but I'm talking about the Jumbotron imagery that you see in New York Times Square, which he bought. And the most I heard about that was that Laureen Powell Jobs, who was on the board back then and a part owner, that she was pissed off about the spend. I heard that from Watson himself. And I think for him, this fell under the narrative, better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And that was his what he used to justify his attempt to foist himself on the American public as a personality. So
the other challenge is to try to figure out if there's any other levers that will work for your boss.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, certainly somebody on Eric Adams' staff
Yeah.
probably did say to him, there's huge exposure for you here in terms of publicity, in terms of like legality. Like, this is an unnecessary risk that you are taking. Right.
Yeah.
That, and whatever his reason is. So it might not be financial. And then I think looking at, are there any regulatory levers that you can pull? Right? Like, this is one where, depending on your level of concern and the circumstances you're in, you may need to go over your boss's head. You may need to play whistleblower. You may need to go to the, bookkeeper or CFO or whoever is financially responsible. Now, the challenge is that oftentimes the person who should be responsible for managing that spending already knows about it and isn't doing anything. Right. So that may not be effective. I think another thing is to try to understand why your boss is doing it. And once you understand that narrative, it might give you some more ammunition to talk to them. So I my Substack this week is about different financial stories that we tell ourselves and how they can be damaging. And one of them is it's called the money status script.
Yeah.
And this is based on research. And one of the ideas is that people spend money so they can look more important. Right?
Or feel more important, right?
Or feel more important, right? And they might be spending on, clothes or house or, a watch or whatever. It's a keep up with the Joneses sort of a motivation, right? And I mentioned that I worked for a boss when I was working in an advertising agency who was a profligate spender, who would spend ridiculous amounts of money on new business pitches, which is what I was doing at the time, right? And a new business pitch, particularly in the day, was like a Broadway show, and people would spend money and, like, let's put a car up on the roof. True story.
Yeah.
So I generally wanted budget for new business, what we called pitch theater. But this guy was like, you spend more, do this, let's buy this, let's go do this, let's travel this way, let's bring all these people. And I am relatively fiscally conservative, and it was my department, and I didn't want somebody to come in from the parent company and be like, wait, why did you spend, why did you spend $500,000 on a pitch we had very little chance of winning? And what I realized is that he was motivated by the status script, although I didn't know that's what it was at the time, that he really wanted to look like the kind of boss who could say, we're going to put a car on the roof, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. He didn't have the attention to detail to look at the actual money that was coming in. And so what I found was that as long as I did what he was asking, he didn't look at how much it cost. So there were a number of times where he thought I had done some what we call gratuitous pitch theater at great expense. Oh my goodness, I spent so much money. When in reality, I called in a favor from a friend. I did a little bit like, let's do this or I'll do this, and was able to come in for something at $5,000 instead of $50,000. Right. So that when he would decide, he would do this sometimes with talent too. He'd be like, I want these freelancers. And I'm like, you know what they cost a day, right? You know how much they spent on their per diem on wine last time they worked for us. And he's like, no, we must have them. We must have them. And so that's another way, is to understand, why is your boss doing this? And does that give you any kind of leverage? Because I think the people that I'm thinking most about are people in my circumstance, where you're not a frontline worker. You are a manager who has responsibility for profit and loss or sales or something. And you're the one that's going to get in trouble because your boss is pressing you to spend money like a drunken sailor.
I think this is undergirded by what you're speaking to, but not actually saying, which is like, I think these are massive red flags. And if you can work it out so that you can stay comfortably, you should stay comfortably. But if you can't work it out so you stay comfortably, you need to leave, because the way Stephanie has put it together, what's happening is you got a built-in fall guy. And in that instance, it would have been Stephanie. I'll put the car on the roof. Yeah, okay, we're going to put the car on the roof. It doesn't go well. It's just, I got bad advice. It's my team. It's my team. And so you are in a direct line of fire, I believe, if you've got a profligate boss. You're never going to carry the weight for that. In my experience, they never have. So,
and recognizing that there's very few of these charismatic bosses who are touted as having all of this business acumen and genius and the Midas touch. Very few of them actually exist.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people that pretend to be that, and we can look at just in the time that we've been doing this show, like, there's a lot of folks who were touted as, I'm the crypto god, I'm the this, I'm this, and they're now, doing
in jail. And also the thing is too, you use the word pretend, and I'd even be careful using that word because, and this is a legal defense that at least one of them had used. If you really believe, like Tug McGraw, you got to believe, or was it Yogi Berra? I'm not a baseball guy. If you got to believe, in some of these cases, I believe they really believe, right? Which means then we're talking a mental health issue. It's something else entirely, right?
Right, but that's not going to damage the impact of
no
actions, right? Like someone who is having a mental health crisis who stabs someone else in the neck, that their mental health crisis should be considered in any kind of sentencing that they have, but they still killed somebody. Right. And I think that some of the repercussions financially, some of these profligate bosses or some of these crazy decisions resulted in people losing not just their jobs, but in some cases their pensions, their financial livelihood. Anybody that did crazy work for stock options and thought that was actually going to that's actually going to do something for them.
I wish I knew somebody like that. I might be able to help them now.
But again, that's another way, is that if you buy into this delusion that a particular leader has the Midas touch, then you're going to be more susceptible to thinking that your stock options are going to be great and that it makes sense for you to work 80 hours a week for a, dysfunctional and abusive boss because it's going to look great on your resume or whatever.
Yeah.
And, there are lots of people in Seattle that I have met who worked at Microsoft in the very beginning, and they got a lot of stock and they're incredibly wealthy and they can do whatever they want to. Right. I remember talking to a guy and he had a vineyard, and he was talking about having a vineyard and that it was fun. And I was like, but how, what's your business model? Like, in other words, how are you making money? And he's like, oh yeah, Microsoft in the day. And I was like, oh, okay. So you're basically so rich that you can do whatever it is that you want. Right. But for most of us, I had stock options too, and saw $0 from getting them. So beware of any kind of profligate behavior. Beware of organizations or institutions, nonprofit or for-profit, that don't have reasonable financial guardrails, that don't have transparency, and stay far, far away if you can.
You know what organization is really good at dealing with profligate bosses? The mafia. You want some jobs, a certain type of job security, that made me think about joining the mafia, because profligate bosses in the mafia are not looked upon kindly.
I can't speak from personal experience, having non-coached any people in the mafia.
Well, given my field of journalism, I have, and it doesn't work out well for them. So
yeah, well, and again, strangely, organizations that are more hierarchical, where there are specific checks and balances, where people are held accountable, they're a little bit out of style now. But there is a sense that that there are consequences for choices, and I think people are less likely. There's always going to be bad actors. There's always going to be embezzlers. There's always going to be whatever. But what we're talking about are bosses who could spend more effectively, who aren't, and why.
Yeah.
I think that's what we've got today. As always, I will invite you to write us emails, wtf@badbossbrief.com. I do respond to every email. I got a really interesting one from a listener in Australia. Thank you for writing. And I realized like you can write an email and you will get a personal response from a board certified executive coach. That would be me. And why not? Because we want more ideas for future Bad Boss briefs, as well as we want to get back to the Sub Rosa, which is our little mini advice podcast. So, so that's what we got, and we will see.
I would also like to add, if you've got a profligate boss and you understand them for what they are, you could also, prior to leaving that company, just enjoy the ride. Right? I've been in that position as well. The phrase that got me was, "We're putting you up in the best hotel in Tokyo, Eugene." And I was like, yes, profligate bosses rule. So anyway.
Okay, good to see the silver lining on that particular cloud. All right, thanks everybody. See you in a couple weeks. Bye.
Adios.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Bad Boss Brief podcast with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's number 3, on Instagram. Reach out with your questions, concerns, work case situations, or suggestions to us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. We personally answer every submission. Be sure to join us at badbossbrief.substack.com every other Wednesday for episodes of Bad Boss Brief so you can gain further insights into your workplace environments. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.